4 billion people, more than half of humanity alive at this very moment, claims a direct connection to a single man who was born over 4,000 years ago in a city most have never heard of. Jews, Christians and Muslims, three religions that spent centuries killing each other, agree on at least one thing. This man is the father of it all, but here is what no one tells you. This same man grew up in a family that manufactured clay idols to sell at the market. His father was a craftsman of false gods. He spent the first decades of his life surrounded by pagan rituals, sacrifices to stone statues, and a religion that worshipped the moon. And it was exactly this man, not a priest, not a prophet, not a prince, whom God chose to start everything from scratch. The question almost no one asks is, why? What was so special about an idol maker in Mesopotamia that the creator of the universe decided to bet the entire history of humanity on him? To understand Abraham, you must first understand where he came from. And where he came from will surprise you. Ur of the Chaldeans was not a lost village in the desert. It was one of the most advanced cities in the ancient world. We are talking about a metropolis with about 65,000 inhabitants, larger than most European cities would be for the next 3,000 years. Ur was located in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, just a few miles from the Euphrates River, and when archaeologists excavated the site in the early 20th century, what they found shocked the world. Two-story houses with indoor plumbing, schools where children learned mathematics and cuneiform writing on clay tablets, commercial contracts, property records, courts of law. Ur had an organized tax system, international trade with the Indus Valley, more than 3,000 kilometers away, and a merchant class so sophisticated that they traded in weighed silver as a standard currency. Imagine. While most of humanity still lived in mud huts, Ur already had bureaucracy. But the heart of Ur was not trade, it was religion. And here the story gets dark. In the center of the city rose the ziggurat of Ur, a step tower of mud bricks that rose over 20 meters high, equivalent to a 7-story building. This architectural monster was dedicated to Nana, the moon god. And it was not just a decorative monument, it was the axis of all life in the city. The priests of Nana controlled the economy, politics, and even the agricultural calendar. They determined when to plant, when to harvest, and when to do business. Disobeying the temple was not heresy. It was social and financial suicide. The cult of Nana involved rituals that would make any modern person shudder. Nighttime processions under the full moon, where priestesses danced in trances. Offerings of burned animals at the top of the ziggurat, with the smell of fat and incense descending over the city like a permanent cloud. And in times of crisis, drought, war, epidemic, records suggest that the price to appease Nana went up. A lot. It was in this world that Abram was born. That was his original name before God changed it. Son of Terah, man whom Jewish tradition describes as a manufacturer of idols. Genesis 11 gives us the dry genealogy. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot and died before his father, still in Ur. It looks like a bureaucratic record, but it hides a tragedy. Haran is the first recorded case in the Bible of a son dying before his father. And Lot, the nephew Abraham would carry with him for the rest of his life as a burden of responsibility, becomes an orphan right there in Ur. Now the Bible does not describe Abraham's childhood. There are no canonical accounts of how he grew up, what he thought, or when he began to question the clay gods his father sculpted. But ancient Jewish traditions, especially the Midrash and the Book of Jubilees, paint a fascinating portrait. According to these texts, Abram observed from a young age something that no one around him seemed to notice. The idols his father made did absolutely nothing. They were pieces of clay, breakable, useless. There is a famous story in the Midrash that even though it is not a biblical text, reveals a profound truth about Abraham's character. It is said that one day Terah left young Abram in charge of the idol shop while he went out to handle business. When the father returned, he found all the idols destroyed, all except the largest one, which held a staff in its hand. Terah asked furiously what had happened. Abram replied with the most serious face in the world, "A woman brought an offering of food." The idols began to fight among themselves to see who would eat first. The largest one took the staff and destroyed all the others. Terah exploded. "Are you crazy? They are made of clay. They cannot move, they cannot eat, they cannot do anything." And Abram replied, "Then why do you bow down before them?" Think of the absurdity and the courage of that scene. A young man confronting not only his father, but the entire economic and religious system of the city where he lived. Questioning the gods of Ur was not abstract philosophy. It was a direct attack on the power structure that kept society functioning. And Abram did this at a time when the concept of monotheism did not exist. There was no word for one God. He was seeing something that literally no one around him could see. It is at this point that the story takes a turn that will define the course of all civilization. Genesis 12, verse 1. 4 words in Hebrew that would change everything. Lech lecha, go forth. God speaks directly to Abram, and what he says is brutal in its simplicity. Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Realize what is being asked here. It is not travel to a better place. It is not move to a different neighborhood. It is to abandon everything. Each layer of the request is more painful than the last. First, leave your country, leave your homeland, the only culture you know. Second, leave your kindred. Cut ties with your safety net, your cousins, your business allies. Third, leave your father's house. Abandon the last person who connects you to the world, and go where? To the land that I will show you. God doesn't even state the destination. It is a blank check. Leave everything you have and walk to a place I have not yet revealed to you. Now comes the detail that most people skip without noticing. Genesis 12:4 says that Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. 75. In the ancient world, 75 years meant you had already lived longer than the vast majority of human beings. Abram was not a young adventurer seeking fortune. He was a man who, by any reasonable metric, should have been leaning back in a chair watching the sunset for the rest of his days. And it is exactly at this moment, when the body says it's over, that God says, "Now it begins." If you believe that God can change any life at any moment, comment "never too late." And the promise that accompanies the order is so disproportionate that it borders on the absurd. "I will make of you a great nation. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." All of them. Not some. Not just those in the Middle East. All the families of the earth. God is telling a childless old man, married to a sterile woman, that from him will come a nation so great that the entire world will be impacted. The math simply doesn't add up, and that is exactly why this promise is so extraordinary. Sarai, who would later become Sarah, was sterile. The biblical text is direct. Sarai was sterile. She had no children. Genesis makes a point of marking this even before the promise is made. It is not a detail thrown in by chance. It is the biblical author setting the stage so you understand the magnitude of what is about to happen. Because the promise of a great nation made to any man would already be bold. Made to a 75-year-old man with a wife who could never conceive a child. It is humanly impossible. And yet Abram went. Genesis 12:4. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. No negotiation, no counter-proposals, no asking for a sign, a confirmation, or a map. He simply got up and went. He took Sarai, his wife, He took Lot, the orphaned nephew he had adopted as a responsibility. He took the servants, the flocks, everything they had accumulated in Haran, and he went south toward a land he had never seen, following the voice of a God that no one around him knew. Try to visualize this caravan. Dozens of people walking through the Syrian desert toward Canaan. Camels loaded with goat hair tents, leather skins full of water, sacks of grain, bronze tools, the sun beating down mercilessly on the limestone ground, the wind kicking up fine dust that sticks to the skin, eyes and teeth. With every step, becomes more distant. With every night camped under the stars, the world Abram knew disappears a little more. The most likely route followed the so-called Fertile Crescent, going up from Haran in northern Mesopotamia, then down the coast of Syria to Canaan. It was more than 1,000 kilometers of walking. On foot, with animals and cargo, this meant months of travel. Months crossing the territories of hostile tribes, crossing rivers, going around mountains, no paved roads, no maps, no guarantee of finding water at the next well. And when Abram finally arrived in Canaan, what he found was not exactly the promised land of dreams. Genesis 12:6 records a subtle but devastating detail. The Canaanites were then in the land. The promised land already belonged to someone. It wasn't empty, waiting for him with a welcome sign. It was occupied by peoples who had their own cities, their own armies, their own gods. Abram arrived as a stranger, as an immigrant, as a nobody. But it is in Shechem, near the Oak of Moreh, that God appears again. And this time, the promise gets an address. To your offspring I will give this land. Genesis 12:7. Notice, God does not say to you, I will give this land. He says to your offspring. Abram will not possess any of this in his lifetime. He is receiving a promise that will only be fulfilled when he is already dead. And what does Abram do? He builds an altar. In the middle of a hostile territory, surrounded by Canaanites who worshipped Baal and Asherah, this old man raises stones and worships the invisible God who brought him there. Here something happens that reveals the real complexity of Abraham, because the Bible is not a book of perfect heroes. Right after arriving in the promised land, right after building altars and receiving promises, hunger struck. A severe famine hit Canaan. And what did the father of faith do? He went down to Egypt, the same Egypt that centuries later would enslave his descendants. And that wasn't all. Fearing that the Egyptians would kill him to keep Sarai, who was a woman of extraordinary beauty, even at 65, Abram asked her to lie. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me for your sake, and that my soul may live because of you. Genesis 12:13. The man who abandoned everything by faith, the man who walked 1,000 kilometers following a divine voice, is now asking his wife to pretend to be his sister to save his own skin. And technically it wasn't a complete lie. Sarai was his half-sister, daughter of the same father but a different mother. But the intention was clearly to deceive. What happened next was exactly what Abram feared and planned to avoid. Only worse. Sarai was taken to Pharaoh's palace and to Pharaoh's. Pharaoh was enchanted by her and showered Abram with gifts: sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Abram became rich at his own wife's expense in another man's harem. It is an uncomfortable scene. The biblical text does not try to soften it. There is no pious justification. It is there, raw, honest, human. But God did not remain silent. Genesis 12:17, but the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai. The plagues, and note that this is the first time the word plagues appears linked to Egypt, centuries before Moses, were so severe that Pharaoh discovered the truth. And his reaction is almost comical in its indignation. What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, she is my sister? the pagan Pharaoh, giving a moral lesson to the patriarch of faith. The Bible is not afraid to show its heroes failing. And if this surprises you, if you expected a perfect, immaculate, flawless Abraham, get ready. Because this weakness in Egypt is only the first of many cracks in the armor of the father of faith. And that is exactly what makes his story so powerful, because God did not choose Abraham because he was perfect. He chose him despite his imperfections. And what comes next? The separation from Lot, the war of the kings, and the most terrifying blood covenant you have ever heard of will reveal a layer of Abraham that most preachers never mention. Abram left Egypt humbled, but rich, absurdly rich. Pharaoh, even while furious, did not take back the gifts. Perhaps out of fear of the God who sent the plagues, perhaps due to diplomatic protocol. The fact is that Abram went back up to the Negev carrying a fortune he did not have when he went down: sheep, oxen, silver, gold, servants. And among these servants was a young Egyptian woman named Hagar. Remember that name. She is going to set off a bomb in the middle of this family that echoes to this day, literally to this day, in the conflict between Arabs and Jews. But that comes later. The immediate problem was different. Abram was rich. Lot was rich. And the land could not support both of them together. Genesis 13:6 is surgical. The land could not support them dwelling together, for their possessions were great. Think about what that means in practice. Herds of hundreds, perhaps thousands of animals needing pasture and water in the same semi-arid territory. Abram's shepherds fighting with Lot's shepherds over every well, every green valley, every bit of shade. The tension between the two caravans growing day after day, like a stretched rope about to snap. And it is here that Abraham does something that no patriarch of the ancient world would do. He, the elder, the leader, the uncle who had absolute authority over his nephew, offers Lot the right to choose first. Let there be no strife between me and you. Is not the whole land before you? If you go to the left, I will go to the right. If you go to the right, I will go to the left. Genesis 13:8-9. This is not just generosity, this is strategic madness. In the ancient world, the elder chose first, always. Without exception, the firstborn inherited double. The patriarch had precedence over everyone. Abram was giving up a right that no one gave up, but he could afford to be generous because he knew something Lot did not know. He had promise. God had already said that all that land would belong to his descendants. It didn't matter which piece Lot chose. In the end, it would all come back to Abram. When you have a promise from the creator of the universe, you don't need to fight over water wells. Lot looked around, and what he saw sealed his fate. The plain of the Jordan stretched to the east like a green carpet shimmering under the sun. Genesis compares the region to the Garden of Eden and the land of Egypt. It was fertile, irrigated, exuberant, and right in the heart of that plain were two cities that were already famous or infamous in the ancient world, Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot chose with his eyes. He saw the abundant water, the green pasture, the prosperity of the cities, and he pitched his tents as far as Sodom. Note the progression the Bible marks with surgical precision. First he looked toward Sodom, then he camped near Sodom, and in the following chapters you will find him living inside Sodom, sitting at the city gate as an established citizen. That is how the fall works. It is never a jump. It is a series of small steps in the wrong direction. And the next verse is a time bomb planted in the text. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Genesis 13:13. Lot chose the most beautiful land and camped next to the most dangerous people. And what was Abram left with? The dry mountains of Canaan, the stony ground, the narrow valleys, land no one would choose. But it was exactly there, in the least desirable place, that God appeared again. Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever, forever. Not for a 50-year contract, forever. But Lot's choice did not take long to take its toll. Genesis 14 opens with a war that most people skip, but it is one of the most historically rich passages in the entire Old Testament. 4 kings from the east, led by Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, had dominated 5 cities of the Jordan Plain for 12 years, collecting heavy tribute. In the 13th year, the 5 cities rebelled. In the 14th, Chedorlaomer returned with his allies to crush the revolt. These 4 kings were not tribal leaders of half a dozen soldiers. Elam was a military power east of Mesopotamia in what is now Iran. The coalition included kings from Shinar, Babylon, and other regions that controlled vital trade routes. When this war machine descended upon the Jordan Plain, the result was a massacre. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell into the bitumen pits of the valley of Siddim. Their cities were looted, and Lot, who had chosen that beautiful and fertile plain, was taken prisoner along with his entire family and all his possessions. A fugitive arrived at Abram's camp with the news. And here a transformation occurs that reveals a facet of Abraham that almost no one associates with the peaceful patriarch taught in Sunday school. Genesis 14:14. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Stop for a second. 318 men trained for combat, born within Abram's camp. This is not a shepherd with half a dozen servants. This is a warlord with a private army. To have 318 home-born warriors, Abram needed to have a camp of at least 1,000 to 2,000 people. He was not just any nomad. He was the equivalent of a Bedouin sheikh with real military power. And what Abram did with these 318 men against a coalition of 4 kings that had just destroyed 5 cities is pure guerrilla military tactics. He divided his forces, attacked at night, and pursued the invaders from Dan to Hobah, north of Damascus. That's more than 200 kilometers of pursuit. Abram not only rescued Lot, he recovered all the captured people, all the women, all the people, and all the goods against a professional army that had just won a regional war, a group of shepherds armed with bronze spears, one using speed, surprise, and darkness. The victory was so complete and so unexpected that when Abram returned, 2 kings came out to meet him. And these 2 encounters, separated perhaps by minutes, reveal everything about who Abraham really was. The first was the king of Sodom. Defeated, humbled, covered in bitumen from the pits where he had fallen, this king came with a simple offer. Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself. Genesis 14:21. It was a reasonable proposal. Abram had won the war. By the customs of the time, all the spoil was his by right. The slaves, the gold, the flocks, everything. The king of Sodom was basically begging to have his citizens back and offering all the material wealth in exchange. For any warrior of the ancient world, it was an offer impossible to refuse. But before Abram could answer the king of Sodom, the second king appeared, and this is one of the most mysterious characters in the entire Bible, Melchizedek, king of Salem, which tradition identifies as the future Jerusalem, and priest of God Most High. He brought bread and wine, and blessed Abram with words that would echo for millennia. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Who was Melchizedek? The text does not say where he came from, who his father was, who his mother was, when he was born, or when he died. He appears out of nowhere, blesses Abram, and disappears from the narrative like a flash of lightning. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament will spend an entire chapter trying to explain this man. comparing him directly to Christ, an eternal priest, without genealogy, without beginning or end. But at that moment, what mattered was the gesture. Abram, the victorious warrior, bowed before this king-priest and gave him a tithe of everything, 10% of all the spoils of war. It is the first time the tithe appears in the Bible, and it came from Abraham. And after that, Abram turned to the king of Sodom and said something that redefines the concept of integrity. I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. Genesis 14:22-23. Nothing. He accepted absolutely nothing. A man who had just risked his life in a military operation against 4 kings, who had lost men, spent resources, marched hundreds of kilometers, refused every coin, every sheep, every piece of fabric, because Abram's wealth could not come from Sodom. There could be no doubt about the source of his prosperity. Everything he had and everything he would have would come from God, from no one else. After the adrenaline of war, after the diplomacy with kings, after the refusal of Sodom's fortune, came the silence. And in the silence came fear. Genesis 15 begins with a phrase that shows Abraham was human to the core. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, fear not. If God is saying not to be afraid, it is because Abram was afraid. And it makes sense. He had just humiliated 4 powerful kings. Retaliation could come at any moment, and all he had were 318 men against empires. But Abram's fear went beyond war. What came out of his mouth next is the most honest cry in all of patriarchal Bible history. O Lord God, what will you give me, for I continue childless? Genesis 15:2. There it is, the open wound. All the promises, the land, the nation, the universal blessing depended on one thing, a son, and Abram had none. Sarai remained sterile. The years were passing, and the heir of his house, the man who would keep everything if Abram died that day, was Eliezer of Damascus, a servant, not a son, an employee. God's answer did not come with theological explanations. It came with an experience. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Genesis 15:5. Imagine this moment. An old man over 75 years old, standing in the Negev desert at night without any artificial light for hundreds of miles. The Milky Way stretched from horizon to horizon like a river of white fire, thousands, millions of points of light so dense the sky seemed solid. And God saying, Count, try to count. This is the magnitude of what I will do through you. And the next verse is perhaps the most important in the entire Hebrew Bible. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6. This single sentence will ground Paul's theology, the doctrine of the Protestant Reformation, and the understanding of billions of people about what it means to have a relationship with God, not by sacrifices, not by rituals, not by works, by faith. Abram believed, and that was enough, but God knew that Abram's faith needed something concrete. And what happened next is the most terrifying scene in the entire book of Genesis. God told Abram to take a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Abram cut them in half, except for the birds, and placed each half opposite the other, creating a corridor of meat and blood between the carcasses. The ground was soaked in dark red, the metallic smell of fresh blood mixed with the desert heat, and birds of prey began to descend upon the bodies, and Abram spent the whole day driving them away, alone covered in blood, waiting without knowing for what. When the sun went down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. It was not a sleep of rest. The text says that a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. The Hebrew word for this terror is aima, a supernatural dread, a horror that does not come from the physical world. Lying among split carcasses, plunged into a darkness that seemed to have weight, Abram heard God describe the future of his descendants. 400 years of slavery in a foreign land. 400 years. God did not hide the price. Before sealing the promise, he made clear the suffering that would come with it. And then it happened. In total darkness, between the halves of the dead animals, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. Genesis 15:17. This was not a campfire. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was the visible presence of God passing through the corridor of blood. To understand what this meant, you need to understand the ritual. In the ancient world, when two kings made a covenant, both walked between the split animals. The meaning was explicit. If I break this pact, may what happened to these animals happen to me. It was a death oath. Both parties committed themselves equally, under penalty of being torn apart like those carcasses. But in this covenant only God passed between the pieces. Abram was sleeping. He did not walk. He did not swear. He did not commit to anything. God took upon himself all the responsibility of the pact, both ends of the covenant. If the promise fails, if the offspring does not come, if the land is not delivered, if the blessing does not reach all nations, the Creator of the universe was saying, "Let me be torn apart." It is the divine equivalent of signing a contract where only one party can be punished, and that party is God. Now think about what just happened. A childless man married to a sterile woman, sleeping in a field soaked with animal blood, has just received the most unilateral covenant in history, a covenant that does not depend on him, that cannot be broken by his failure, that is sustained exclusively by the word and honor of God himself. This is why theologians call this an unconditional covenant. Abram did not need to do anything to keep it valid. It was already sealed, in blood, in fire, in darkness, and this covenant will haunt human history like a shadow that does not disappear, crossing empires, exiles, holocausts, and resurgences that defy all historical logic. But if God had promised everything, the sun, the land, the nation, why had the most natural thing in the world still not happened? Why did Sarai remain unable to get pregnant? The years passed. The promise grew older, and Sarai's patience was reaching its limit. What she did next will plant a seed of conflict that 4,000 years later is still shedding blood in the Middle East. Sarai was 85 years old when her patience ran out. 10 years living in Canaan, 10 years since the original promise, 10 years waking up every month with the same hope and sleeping every night with the same disappointment. And she made a decision that, in our modern eyes, seems absurd, but in the ancient world was perfectly legal, documented in clay contracts that archaeologists found in Nutsi, Mesopotamia. Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. Genesis 16:2, Hagar, the young Egyptian woman, the one I told you to remember. Sarai gave her to Abram as a sort of middle Bronze Age surrogate mother. And before you judge, understand that this was not betrayal, it was not immorality, it was not a deviation, it was legal protocol. The Nutsi contracts, dating from the 2nd millennium BC, describe exactly this practice. If the primary wife was sterile, she should provide a servant to the husband, and the child born would be legally considered the wife's child. The servant gestated, the mistress raised, the heir was legitimate. Everything within the rules, but legal rules do not control the human heart. And what happened next proves that the sharpest pain does not come from enemies, it comes from within one's own house. Hagar became pregnant, and the moment that belly began to grow, the entire dynamic of the tent changed. The text is brutal in its honesty. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Genesis 16:4. Hagar looked at Sarai with something every woman recognizes, that silent contempt that needs no words. Every time Hagar touched her belly, every time she smiled in a specific way, every time she walked a little slower, displaying the weight she carried. It was a soundless message. I can do what you cannot, and Sarai broke down. May the wrong done to me be on you, she shouted at Abram. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between me and you, Genesis 16:5. The man who had faced 4 kings, who had refused the fortune of Sodom, who had received visions from God Most High, this man looked at the war between 2 women in his own tent and did the most cowardly thing possible. He washed his hands. Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Genesis 16:6. And what Sarai did was so harsh that Hagar fled. Pregnant, alone, without water, without food, without a destination. An Egyptian slave in the middle of the Negev desert, walking toward Egypt like a wounded animal trying to go back home. And here something happens that most people do not notice, and that was revolutionary for the time. God went after Hagar, not Abram, not Sarai. Hagar, a slave, a foreigner, a woman without rights, without a family name, without a tribe to protect her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness on the way to Shur. And the first thing he said was, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Genesis 16:8. He called her by name. In the ancient world, slaves did not have names, they had functions. But God knew her name, and the instruction that followed was very hard. Go back to Sarai. Submit yourself. But along with the instruction came a promise that no slave in the ancient world ever received. I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Genesis 16:10. The same language used with Abram, the same words. Countless offspring, for a runaway Egyptian slave in the desert, and more. Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Ishmael, in Hebrew, Yishmael. It literally means God hears. The boy's name would be a permanent reminder that God hears the cry of a slave. And Hagar did something that no other biblical character did before her. She gave a name to God. You are a God of seeing, she said, El Roi, the God who sees. Genesis 16:13, a slave named the Creator. And the well where this happened was named Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. And that well existed. Archaeologists and biblical geographers locate it between Kadesh and Bered in northern Sinai. A real place marked forever by the moment God saw a woman no one else saw. Hagar returned. She submitted, and she gave birth to Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old. Finally, he had a son, an heir, a boy who would grow up running among the flocks, learning to shoot with a bow, becoming what the text later describes as a wild donkey of a man, free, indomitable, living in conflict with everyone around him. Islamic tradition considers Ishmael the direct ancestor of Muhammad and the Arabs. Jewish tradition recognizes that he was the first son, but not the son of the promise. And in this fracture, in this distinction between the son who came from the human plan and the son who would come from the divine plan, a rivalry was born that has crossed millennia and continues to bleed. And then silence, 13 years of absolute silence. From Genesis 16 to Genesis 17, 13 years pass in a single turn of the page. No visions, no voice, no angels. Abram lived 13 years raising Ishmael, probably convinced that the boy was the fulfilled promise. 13 years believing that Sarai's plan had worked, that God had used Hagar to fulfill his word. 13 years of normalcy, of routine, of a shepherd's life. And on the first day of the 14th year, when Abram was 99 years old, God appeared. And what he said demolished everything Abram thought he knew. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Genesis 17, 1-2. Abram fell on his face. And God continued speaking, adding layer upon layer to the original promise. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Genesis 17:5. Abram meant exalted father. Abraham means father of multitudes. Imagine walking through the camp with that name for 13 years without a legitimate son. Every time someone called Abraham, it was a public reminder of the promise and the apparent failure. It was like giving a bankrupt man the nickname millionaire and making him answer to it every day. And it didn't stop there. Sarai also got a new name, Sarah. From my princess to princess, without the possessive, without belonging to just one man, princess of nations. And God said the words that made Abraham laugh, literally laugh, with his face pressed to the ground. Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Genesis 17:19. Abraham was 99 years old, Sarah was 90, and his reaction was to guffaw. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" Genesis 17:17. It was not a laugh of faith, it was a laugh of absurdity, of incredulity, the father of multitudes lying on the ground laughing at God's promise. And the first thing that came out of his mouth after the laughter was an attempt at negotiation. "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you," Genesis 17:18. Translating, "God, forget this impossible plan. I already have Ishmael. He is 13 years old. He is strong. He is healthy. Bless him and let's stop here." But God did not accept the substitute. Ishmael would be blessed, 12 princes, a great nation. But the covenant, the eternal promise, the lineage that would change the world, that would pass through Isaac, through the son who did not yet exist, through the impossible son. But before the son came the sign, and the sign was not pretty: circumcision. Every male in Abraham's house, himself, Ishmael, every servant, every slave, should be circumcised. A cut in the flesh that would forever mark the difference between the children of the covenant and the rest of the world. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. Ishmael was 13, and on that very day, every man in the camp was circumcised. Think of the logistics of that. Hundreds of men, all wounded at the same time, all incapacitated at the same time. The entire camp vulnerable, without a single warrior in condition to fight. It was an act of faith as extreme as anything Abraham had ever done. If any enemy attacked at that moment, it would be a massacre. But no one attacked, and while the camp recovered, the heat of Mamre intensified like an oven, and something was coming that no one expected. Genesis 18 opens with a domestic scene that hides an earthquake. And the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. It was noon. The vertical sun of the desert made every stone a brazier. Abraham was sitting in the shade of the tent entrance, probably dozing, when he lifted his eyes and saw 3 men standing before him. His reaction was immediate and disproportionate. He ran to meet them. He bowed with his face to the ground. He offered water to wash their feet, shade to rest, and a morsel of bread, which actually turned into an absurdly elaborate meal. Abraham ran to Sarah and told her to prepare 3 measures of fine flour, about 20 kilograms of bread. Then he ran to the herd, took a fat calf, and told a servant to prepare it. Butter, milk, roasted meat, fresh bread. For 3 strangers in the middle of the desert. Hospitality in the ancient world was sacred law. But this went further. Abraham, 99 years old, recently circumcised, running back and forth under a 40-degree sun to serve strangers. It was as if he knew or felt that these were no ordinary travelers. And they weren't. While they ate, and the text says they ate, which generated centuries of theological debate about whether angels can eat. One of them asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" The fact that he knew her name was already revealing. And then came the promise, for the third time, but now with a set date. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Genesis 18:10. Sarah was listening behind the tent curtain, and she laughed. Just as Abraham had laughed weeks before, Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" Genesis 18:12. And the visitor, whom the text now explicitly identifies as the Lord, turned to Abraham and asked the question that defines the limits between the human and the divine. Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Genesis 18:13-14. Sarah lied. "I did not laugh," she said, afraid. And the answer was short, like a thunderclap. "No, but you did laugh." 3 words. He knew. He always knows. After the meal, the visitors got up and looked towards Sodom. And the Lord did something extraordinary. He thought out loud, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" Genesis 18:17. It was as if God were deliberating with himself whether or not he should reveal his plans to the patriarch. And he decided to tell him. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was great. Their sin was very grave. And God would go down to see if what he had heard corresponded to reality. Destruction was coming. The 2 angels went on to Sodom. But Abraham stood before the Lord. And what happened next is the most audacious negotiation in sacred history. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Abraham started at 50. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? And God granted it. Then 45, granted, 40, granted, 30, 20, until reaching 10. For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. Genesis 18:32. Abraham stopped at 10. He didn't ask for 5. He didn't ask for 1. Perhaps because he believed that in the city where Lot lived with his family, there would surely be at least 10 decent people. He was wrong. The 2 angels arrived in Sodom at evening. Lot was sitting at the city gate, exactly the position of a respectable citizen, a judge, or an elder. The man who years before had pitched his tents as far as Sodom was now part of the establishment. And when he saw the 2 strangers, he insisted they stay at his house, not out of courtesy, out of desperation. He knew what happened to strangers in that city after the sun went down. And before they lay down, the house was surrounded. The men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. Genesis 19:4. It was not a group, it was the entire city, every neighborhood, every age group. And what they shouted leaves little room for metaphorical interpretation. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." The Hebrew verb yada, to know, has explicit sexual connotations in this context. And Lot, in a gesture that horrifies modern readers, offered his 2 virgin daughters in place of the guests. The mob's response was worse than the original threat. "Stand back. This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." The angels pulled Lot inside and struck the crowd with blindness, and in the forced darkness of those eyes, the men of Sodom continued groping the door, trying to find the entrance. Blindness did not stop them. The compulsion was greater than the pain. When morning dawned, the angels grabbed Lot by the hand. Literally, the text says they seized his hand, the hand of his wife, and the hands of his 2 daughters, and dragged them out of the city, the Lord being merciful to him. Genesis 19:16. Lot did not leave of his own free will. He was dragged. Mercy came in the form of brute force, and the instruction was direct. Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. Do not look back. This command seems simple, But when the sulfur began to fall, when the sky turned orange and then red and then black, when the ground shook and the air filled with a roar that sounded like the world tearing in half, Lot's wife looked. The text does not explain what she was looking at, the house where she lived, the friends she left behind, the life she knew. Perhaps she was looking at everything at the same time. And she turned into a pillar of salt. She didn't die. She didn't fall. She was transformed. A white statue on the edge of the desert, frozen forever in the act of looking back. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, claimed that the pillar still existed in his time. Medieval travelers claimed to have seen it. To this day, near the Dead Sea, human-shaped salt formations attract pilgrims who swear they are standing before Lot's wife. And Sodom burned. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Genesis 19:24. The plain that Lot had chosen for being beautiful like Eden turned into the lowest point on the Earth's surface, the Dead Sea, 430 meters below sea level, with salinity so high that no fish survives. The most fertile land in the Middle East became the most sterile place on the planet. Geologists found layers of ash and crystallized sulfur along the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea. Spheres of pure sulfur of 98% purity embedded in limestone formations, a degree of purity that does not occur naturally anywhere else on Earth. Something happened there. Something catastrophic, localized and absolute. Whether it was fire from heaven, a natural gas eruption, or a meteor shower that hit underground sulfur deposits, science debates. But that the destruction was real, geology confirms. Abraham woke up that morning and looked towards Sodom. And he looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. Genesis 19:28. The man who had negotiated with God for 10 righteous people discovered there were not even 10. The entire plain was gone, and Lot, the nephew who had chosen with his eyes, lost everything: his wife, his house, his fortune, his dignity. He survived 2 daughters and nothing more, hidden in a cave in the mountains, drunk and destroyed. What happened in that cave is one of the most disturbing passages in Genesis. And from it were born the Moabites and the Ammonites, 2 peoples who would torment Israel for centuries. But that is another story. The smoke of Sodom had not yet dissipated when the impossible promise began to move. Sarah became pregnant at 90 years old. The text offers no medical explanation. It does not rationalize. It does not soften. It simply declares, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him." Genesis 21:1-2. At the appointed time, not at Abraham's time, not at Sarah's time, at God's time. 25 years after the original promise, 25 years of waiting, of doubt, of failed human attempts, of inexplicable divine silences. And the boy's name? Isaac, Yitzhak in Hebrew. It means he laughs, because Abraham laughed when God promised. Sarah laughed when she heard behind the curtain. And now Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." Genesis 21:6. The laughter that had been of incredulity turned into laughter of joy. What was a joke turned into a miracle. The boy's name was living proof that God has a sense of humor and that the last laugh is always his. But joy brought blood. When Isaac was weaned, around age 3, as was the custom, Abraham threw a great feast, and Sarah saw Ishmael laughing. The Hebrew verb used is metzachek, from the same root as Isaac, the one who laughs. Ishmael was laughing, mocking, playing, imitating. The text does not specify, and generations of scholars have debated the exact tone of that laughter. But for Sarah it was enough. Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. And Abraham felt the weight of it in his chest. Ishmael was his son, his firstborn. 14 years of memories, the first smile, the first steps, the first arrows. But God confirmed. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. And on a morning the text describes with an economy of words that hurts, Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, put it on Hagar's shoulder, gave her the boy, and sent her away. Bread and water. For the desert. For his own son. And then came the test. The test that defines Abraham. The test that defines faith. The test that 4,000 years later still makes theologians, philosophers, and fathers lose sleep. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Genesis 22:1, 2 words in Hebrew, hineni, here I am, present, available, ready. And then God said the most terrible thing a father can hear, Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Notice the construction. God did not simply say sacrifice Isaac, he piled on layers of pain, your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Each word a scalpel, each comma a deeper blade. And Abraham's reaction? The same as when he expelled Ishmael. So Abraham rose early in the morning. No dialogue, no protest, no negotiation. The man who had haggled with God for 10 righteous people in Sodom did not say a single word for his own son. He saddled the donkey. He split the wood. He took 2 servants and Isaac, and he walked for 3 days. 3 days knowing what he was going to do. 3 days looking at the boy who carried the wood on his back without knowing it was the wood for his own pyre. 3 days of silence. The text records not a single word during the journey. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the place from afar. He said to the servants, Stay here. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. We will come again, plural. He said, we will come again, both of them. Was it a lie? Was it faith? Was it an irrational hope that God would find a way out? Hebrews suggests that Abraham believed God could raise Isaac from the dead. If it's true, it was a faith without precedent, because no one had ever been resurrected before. He was inventing theology on the way to the sacrifice. And then Isaac asked, the question that breaks the heart of any father who has ever read this text. Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham replied with the most weight-bearing sentence in all the Bible, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. Genesis 22:8. God will provide. In Hebrew, Yahweh Yireh. And he built the altar, he arranged the wood, he bound Isaac, and the boy did not resist. There is no record of a struggle, a cry, or an escape. Isaac was old enough to carry wood up a mountain. Rabbis estimate between 25 and 37 years old. He was not a helpless child. He was an adult man who let himself be bound. The son's obedience mirrored the father's obedience. And Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife. The angel shouted from heaven at the last second, Abraham, Abraham. And for the second time, Hineni, here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And when Abraham lifted his eyes, he saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket, the lamb that God would provide. And on that mountain, Abraham carved a name into the sacred map of humanity, Yahweh Yireh. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided, Mount Moriah. The same mountain where 1,000 years later Solomon would build the temple. The same mountain where 2,000 years later the Romans would destroy it. The same site where today stands the Dome of the Rock, one of the most disputed spots on the face of the earth. The place where a father almost sacrificed his son became the spiritual epicenter of three religions and the geopolitical pivot of the modern world. Sarah died at the age of 127 in Hebron, and Abraham wept. The patriarch who had faced pharaohs, defeated kings, negotiated with God, and raised the knife over his own son, wept. And then he did something that seems mundane, but was revolutionary. He bought land. He negotiated with Ephron the Hittite, paid 400 shekels of silver, an exorbitant price, probably inflated because the seller knew Abraham had no alternative, and acquired the cave of Machpelah. The first legal property of the people of Israel in the Promised Land was not conquered by the sword. It was bought, with a deed, with witnesses, with counted money, and that cave exists. In Hebron, the Ibrahimi Mosque, or the Tomb of the Patriarchs, marks the spot where tradition states that Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah are buried. It is one of the oldest places of continuous worship on the planet, and one of the most guarded, divided between a synagogue and a mosque, watched over by armed soldiers. Abraham died at the age of 175, and the text records a detail that almost goes unnoticed. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him. Genesis 25:9. The two of them together. The son of the promise and the son of the slave woman, the heir of the covenant and the exile of the desert, side by side, burying their father. At that funeral, for a brief moment, the fracture healed. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Abraham, not perfect faith because he lied, doubted, tried to solve everything alone, and almost destroyed the people he loved in the process. Not flawless obedience because he delayed, questioned, laughed at the promise, and offered substitutes. The lesson is that God does not expect ready-made people. He chooses broken people and walks with them until the promise matures, not in their time, but in his. Abraham is called the father of all nations, not because he was perfect, but because, despite everything, he kept walking. Every time he fell, he got up. Every time he erred, he returned. Every time God's silence seemed eternal, he pitched his tent and stayed. And 4,000 years later, half the population of the planet, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, still invokes his name. A shepherd without land, without a son, without a visible future, who left Ur without knowing where he was going, and changed the history of humanity forever. If you've made it this far, click on the next video appearing on your screen. It was made especially for those who watched this one until the end.